I hope everyone enjoyed the fish. I guess that's appropriate for the conference theme. The afternoon program consists of 3 presentations before we have the end of the day wrap up. We'll have coffee at 3:15 after the first 2 presentations, and so keep that in mind. Our first, Eric, do you have any administrative announcements we need to make before we go on?
There are beer and wine tickets on sale outside after.
Very important message.
It's a real pleasure to be here in Sweden. I haven't been back here for a while. I'd like to thank Eric and Caroline and Anna and Stina for all their help and the rest of the crew. And also, Dimitri, where are you? Thanks for all your help. I appreciate it. So, a little bit about myself. I've been at Los Alamos National Laboratory for about longer than some of you have been on the Earth. And I have a couple of hats that I wear. I'm a physicist by training. We do a lot of high-performance computing, big, fast computers. Worried about plasma physics and transport and nuclear physics and things like that. Part of my job also is to figure out how this microphone works. But anyway, if you can't hear me, please raise your hand and I'll yell. Okay. Another part of our operation involves worrying about threats to national security in the form of underwater WMDs, nuclear devices, biological canisters, chemical weapons, you name it. And we have a 28-man team that is vested with finding, assessing, disabling possible nuclear threats, biological threats. So this is where the diving part of what I do comes into play. Okay, today's talk, a little bit of a discussion about helium, Deco, and why it's good. It used to be a voodoo gas. People were afraid of it because of what was happening, and they didn't understand it nor dive as much. One of the concerns is isobaric counter diffusion, and I'm sure some of you have dealt with it. Don, this morning may have mentioned the possible problem gas mismatch. And a little bit about Deco models and diver staging comparisons, field validation experiments, things that have been done and reported to us by some of you, many of you maybe. And then we're trying to come online, or we are coming online with a data bank to store tech profiles. You all probably know that you guys do some great diving, but it doesn't get recorded, okay? And if it doesn't get recorded, we can't do much with the data, okay? It comes in the general category of anecdotal, okay? So what we're trying to do, and what I and some of my compadres are trying to do, is to store this data. I'll tell you a little bit about that. Okay, for the facts, or I'm going to try to keep it away from equations and hard science and stuff like that. But if you're interested in details, you can check out these books that we've written. Some of you probably have it, and I didn't bring any along, I'm sorry. I would pass them out gladly. Okay, let's talk about helium, okay? We've been diving, our operation started back in around 1981, 82. And in our room at the laboratory, and actually in our vans, we have a sign up, okay? God gave us helium for diving, but the devil replaced it with nitrogen, okay? I think that sort of sets the tone about helium diving as far as we're concerned, and I think it probably sets the tone for helium diving as much as you guys are concerned. It's a good gas for deep diving, decompression diving. It's not a good gas for recreational divers. Why? Helium diffuses about 2.7 times faster than nitrogen. That's great because the in-gas is fast, out-gas is fast. But for recreational diving, the fact that an in-gas is so fast means that the no decompression time limits are shorter than they are for nitrogen. Okay? You may say, well, why aren't they longer? Because it goes in and out so fast. It gets to be a playoff between the solubility of helium and the solubility of nitrogen and their in-gassing and out-gassing speeds. Okay, without going into it, it's 2.7 times faster than nitrogen. It's a good Deco gas, but it's not a good recreational diving gas. It's 1/3 as soluble as nitrogen, okay? That means that you don't have, in principle, the narcosis problems on helium that you have on nitrogen. It's 1/4 as narcotic as nitrogen, which ties into its solubility. In the body, we're not entirely sure, but certainly in experiments we've done, helium bubbles are smaller than nitrogen bubbles, okay, for a given pressurization, depressurization. The reports from you guys and everybody else who dives helium is that when you come to the surface, you feel better on helium. If you've done a helium Deco dive and you've ridden your bottom gas or done some switches back onto trimix in some controlled fashion and then switch over to O2 in the shallow zone, you know, you go right back down 3 or 4 hours later, you feel better. That's not the case with nitrogen diving, okay? This is what we hear from you, and this is what we also feel. And on helium to nitrogen switches should be at shallower depths. I'm going to come back to this, okay? Because there's a strong movement, or there was an early strong movement to switch to nitrogen-based mixtures early because they cut Deco time. That's not a good idea necessarily. Another interesting point that the minimum bends depths, the MBDs for helium, are deeper than nitrogen. So for helium, if you saturate at say like 30 feet of seawater, you can probably come up to the surface. The minimum bend depth is about 32, whereas for nitrogen it's around 20. Okay, this means that your body can deal with a greater degree of saturated helium than it can for nitrogen. It's not to say that you won't have problems, but that's been noted in the literature. Okay, I mentioned that helium bubbles are probably smaller, but more numerous, okay? Smaller but more numerous. These were some experiments that we did at the laboratory in light substrates like gel and agar and molasses and syrup and all that other good stuff. And what we did is we compressed these substrates to a certain pressure, 50, 150, 250 feet of seawater above ambient. And then we decompressed them rapidly, and then we did bubble counts. And you see, we did it for helium, argon, neon, and nitrogen. And you see the bubble counts for helium are higher, and then nitrogen and argon, and then neon. The number of bubbles per unit volume was also higher. So this says something about what helium looks like, what helium bubbles look like when we do experiments in the laboratory. Doesn't mean always that what we do in the laboratory is the same thing that happens in the body. But there's models that we devise build on this fact, okay? And then these models are folded over data, and it's a good starting point for model development. Okay, so helium is a great gas for diving. It's better than nitrogen. However, we need to be a little bit careful diving helium-based mixtures and then switching to nitrox. Okay, possible problems is called ICD, isobaric counterdiffusion. It really means just two gases moving in opposite directions. Depending on the gases and the loadings, it can produce a state of oversaturation or supersaturation higher than it would have gotten with either gas, or it can be lower. Okay. These this type of phenomena affects deep tissues, okay, the ones that are in your body when you're diving. It also affects the skin if you are, putting something other than your breathing mixture in your dry suit. The simplest rule, and I'll talk more about it, is to avoid heavy polite breathing gas switches, okay? You don't go from nitrogen back to helium after you've been diving. It's not a good switch. Air brakes are not a good switch when diving helium. Depends on how long you make those breaks and how long you've been down. But in general, the rule is avoid those. Lighter than breathing mixture gases in your dry suit, possible, skin bends. This has all been done in the laboratory, okay? It's been done a few years ago. And I don't think that all the people who are diving are aware of the great history we have that was done by various doctors and medical community looking at this problem 30 years ago, okay? So in a certain sense, my giving this to you is like I'm reinventing the wheel, in a certain sense, but it's probably worthwhile. Avoid N2 to helium switches and helium in dry suits when breathing air. Well, how does this work? Okay, this busy slide. Suppose we took somebody and we took them down to 200 feet, and we stayed down for an hour or 2 hours or 10 hours. It doesn't matter here. But let's say he's saturated at that depth, and then at some point 0 here, we switch the breathing mixture. So he's breathing 80-20 nitrox, which is air, and now we switch it over to 80-20 heliox. And we see what happens. We look in the very slow tissue compartment for nitrogen, which is the 480-minute compartment, and we look at the equivalent compartment in helium would be the 160, 3 times or 1/3 of 480. And we look at the buildup of gas, okay? So we see the nitrogen gas coming down here, as it should, because there's no nitrogen in the breathing mixture after he switches. And then you see the helium come up, okay? Well, when you add those two inert gases together, look what you get at the top. You get a total gas loading which is greater than either one of those. This is what's called isobaric counter-diffusion. If you work out the mathematics on this, and we've done this, it turns out that maximum, the point of where at the top, maximum total saturation, that occurs at roughly the halftime of the nitrogen tissue. Okay, so in a 480-minute compartment for nitrogen, it happens roughly at 480 minutes. Thank you. If this were a 2 or 3 minute compartment, it would happen for 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, so you see, it depends upon the gas loading, and the bottom time, the amount of oversaturation when you're diving. But the end result is something like this. What do you do if you reverse this process? If this is helium, and then you introduce nitrogen, okay, you get the opposite effect, okay? You would get a subsaturation. You would get these. Take this graph and turn it around, okay? And you'll see that doing it the other way decreases the total gas loading in time, and it helps you for decompression. That's why we advocate nitrogen to helium switches and not the reverse, or helium to nitrogen switches and not the reverse.
Bruce,
yeah.
Would that be the case even though the diver's not saturated on that depth? Would the same sharp increase in total pressure occur?
You mean if you're on the surface and you just switch? No, you wouldn't have. You have to build up gas loadings before anything like this starts to happen. Okay.
Yeah, but if you're at say 30 meters for a short period of time,
yeah,
with the same total pressure that you showed on the graph, would that also be?
Would it happen? Yeah, it would happen.
Not to the same extent.
No, it would happen in the same sense, but the question is, what is the degree of oversaturation, okay? I mean, at 30 feet, your body can take more saturation than it would you know, at 200 feet. You build up a higher gas loading. It's dependent on how long you've been and what the initial gas loadings are before you make a switch. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, it comes into play anytime you go into water, and, or anytime you increase the partial pressures of the gases you're breathing and then do switches. This happens, okay? Physiologically, it's not clear just what the total impacts are, okay? And there are people who are looking at this. But a lot of research has been done before this, and what I'm referring to is what has happened before. Okay, what are some of these switching rules that I just mentioned? Go back, way back to the 60s to Chris Lambertson, who's a well-known American diving guru. When he did his first experiments at Pennsylvania, he said, you know what, guys? No deep air switches. They were very much interested in air switches because the World Navy's dive air, okay? Navies tested some of this stuff, and they're not in that business of testing switches anymore, and came to the conclusion that there shouldn't be any kind of nitrox switching whatsoever below 100 feet. Now what's happening today is that you guys out there are following rules okay, but you're making a switch to nitrox 50 at about 70 feet of seawater, and then switching to Puro 2 in the shallow zone, okay? And it seems to work. We've tried this. We don't dive much open circuit, but we have tried this a couple of times and we have no problems. I also know from dive profiles in the bank that we have that this is being done, okay? So you might consider this kind of a hierarchy. So what's the bottom line? When you do switching, okay, keep the N2 gradient small. In other words, keep an equivalent nitrogen, an END of around 60 or 80 feet of seawater throughout the switching process, so that the amount of nitrogen which is being ingassing, the gradient, is not a slam, it's not huge, okay? You're not going from no nitrogen to nitrogen because the ingassing rate, the gradient is large, okay? We see this in all the open circuit kind of things we do, and we've also seen it in the cave diving profiles at WKPP. And I think a lot of you guys work with them and know them. Doing this gives you a small Deco penalty for increased helium. Okay, what this does is, we have a term we call it isobaric slam. Bottom line, keep the gradient small and keep the END somewhere between 60 or 80. The smaller this number is, okay, the better. You know, nitrogen is not a good gas for diving, for deep decompression diving. All right, here's something, just to give you an idea of what happens when you follow these rules versus something that we've seen out in the field. We take a dive, a T-Nix dive on 1065, 400 feet for 10 minutes. Okay, that's a non-trivial dive. And then we start switching on the way up to 1850, 40, 20, and then we have an EN 80 here and at 30 feet. Well, we could put Puro 2 in there too, that'd be even better. But this is only for comparison's sake. Suppose we did the same thing all the way down, and then, because we get a Deco advantage by switching to nitrox 40 at a depth, and then we follow the same profile, the only difference here is that we have nitrox 40 at 110 feet. Look at the differences in the Deco times. These are run with a, whoa! I guess I missed my switch, huh? Yeah. Oh, that's all right. No problem. So, we're using helium all the way up to the surface, backing off on the helium as we increase oxygen, but keeping the amount of nitrogen in this profile 160 minutes. In this one, where we get a little bit of added or shortened Deco time, you know, it's only about 8 minutes. So the important thing here is that this is questionable, okay? You may get away with it, you may not, who knows? This is a lot safer from the statistics we've been able to gather and from the way we dive and WKPP dive. All right, dive computers, you know, they're coming online. You're getting computers with Helium capabilities. They're changing the way people dive. In the recreational community, I don't think people know how to use dive tables anymore. Okay? They rely on computers. Tech business is something else. In the tech regime, computers are just usually backup, okay? We use them as backup and we have hard tables. We have surface communication and things like that, so that makes it easy. But this is a phenomenon that has come on in, say, the last 10 years, okay? This is a full-up RGBM computer for mixed gases and for rebreathers, open circuit rebreathers. It has full capabilities. You know, the model automatically predicts deep stops. I'm not trying to sell this computer. There are other computers on the market too. This is a tech computer that a lot of people use as a backup. Here's a recreational computer which does nitrox, but it has the same basic bubble algorithm, okay? The big thing about computers and tables coming out today that have been published in the last 5 or 6 years is that they're based on bubble models, okay? Bubble models are the next iteration on what we've seen for a century. And, you know, it's about time. Are they completely right? Well, I think that they've moved up a step. You can buy, you guys out there that do a lot of tech diving, decompression diving, you can get software, okay? Software is dive planning, okay? You don't trust yourself to a computer, you don't trust yourself to diveware, but you know how you've been diving and you know what works. You also know what your colleagues are doing. So there's all kinds of software out there. These are 2 that are out there. There are others, vPlanner and ProPlanner and Estate Planner and so on. There are all kinds of net sites that are serving as list sites for discussions. And the important thing with all these new software packages and these new bubble models and that is that it all started back around 1965, okay? It had started with this profile and also some work that was being done in Australia. This is a published calculation by a fellow by the name of Brian Hills, who recently died, and it compares a standard Navy profile at 120 feet or so for 30 minutes, no, actually 40 minutes, and then the staging is standard US Navy, that's Haldane-based dissolved gas staging, Royal Navy, which is also, it's diffusion-based, but it's still Haldane-like, and then what was called the thermodynamic model, which was probably the first bubble model around that had any play in the business. So what you see is typically what you see when you dive today. You see the traditional models for diver staging, giving stops in the shallow zone and for a longer period of time, versus what bubble models do, deeper staging, and then very much shorter time in the shallow zone. This is what got it all going, okay? This is what got it all going. This, at the time, and I talked to Brian about this, this received stiff resistance in the diving community. And it's really interesting for some of us who work in this business, because this whole business of deep stops was actually tested by Haldane in the 1900s, okay? When he was doing his caisson work in England, and he found out that they were necessary. But he never put them into his staging mathematics, let's call it, or his algorithm, because in dissolved gas models, there's no way to put them in naturally. You have to crank them in ad hoc. It's like making safety stops, and they're cranked in if they're not decompression stops. So It's changing today. What's the problem for all models? Okay? You go down, you breathe, compressed mix, whatever it is. The dissolved gas is circulated through the blood in the body. You are dumping gas into tissue sites. They may or may not be nucleated with seeds which serve to transfer into bubble growth. And the issue is on decompression is to take this dissolved gas and or any bubbles that are formed and move it back out through the systemic circulation, not continue to dump it into more bubbles, okay? What deep stops do is we think that nucleation goes on continuously, okay? Our tissues are rubbing together, they produce seed sites, okay? Gas dumps in. But what we'd like to do is come up with staging protocols that minimize the gas transfer into bubbles, and if there are bubbles, to move this back out to the body. This is the central problem, the central biophysical problem of diving. And the multiplicity of factors that have to be dealt. This is just gas transfer, okay? There's still biochemistry, okay, about which we know very little, okay, and how that impacts decompression. So what do we have in the, what have we seen over the years? Well, we've seen the dissolved gas models and we've seen dual phase models, okay? I put wrong up here only because I was running out of space. I should say that dissolved gas models are half correct because we think DCS is caused by bubbles, not by dissolved gas. So you need to couple dissolved gas to bubbles, okay? That's what dual phase models do, okay? And there are a lot of them floating around. There's the original one of thermodynamic model of Hills. There's the Deviant model of varying permeability. There's our model, the reduced gradient. There's the Nassau model, the tissue bubble diffusion model. And finally, the Navy has come up with the US bubble model, US Navy bubble model. All these have deep stops. These do not, okay? All of these run with nominal parameters will give you deep stops and shorter Deco time overall. What about recreational diving? On air, nitrox 32, nitrox 36. It's all the same, it doesn't matter, okay? All these models collapse down to each other. That's in my humble estimation. What do you, as far as eliminating gas, in addition to the earlier slide, and bubbles, if you want to eliminate dissolved gas, you take the divers as close to the surface as possible, okay? If you want to eliminate bubbles, you got to hold them down deeper, okay? Bubbles are squeezed by increasing pressure. They grow as pressure is released. But the gas gradients for dissolved gas elimination increase as you decrease pressure. So what do? Instead of bringing the diver up here, you hold them here and you try to do a little bit of both. That's what all models do. How did this start to get going? I mean, what was the experimental basis for this? I mean, we know this was diving that was done. This is some deep stop Doppler measurements that were done by Tom Newman, way back in the 70s when this type of phenomenology came into vogue. This is an air dive to 120 feet for 25 minutes, direct ascent to the surface. These are the bubble counts after these surface intervals. And then we do a shallow stop here, 10 feet for 2 minutes. These are the bubble counts. And then down here, we do a deep stop at, I think it was 60 feet for a minute. And then we continue to do the shallow stop for 2 minutes. Look at the reduction in bubble counts, okay? This also met with, maybe so. I think that experiments that have been done today fit in this general category. There's one probably, I don't know if Alpha's going to talk about it or not, but I'll mention it. Okay, part of my job is to worry about WMDs at the laboratory, and also I'm tied in with Navy Special Warfare. We worry about things like this, okay, going off in our harbors or your harbors, okay? We work with governments all around the world. This is a nuclear device that went off. It was in about 40 feet of water, 50 feet of water. It had tremendous implications for the immediate area around the device. Okay, so we worry about these kinds of things. To examine these things and to disable them and to give a good picture of what's going on requires safe and efficient deco diving. We may also tie into, there may be threat reduction on the surface. We work closely with military special operations. Some of these devices can be hidden in caves, okay, or in ledges close to land. When you put a nuclear device up against rock like this, it's what we call ground coupled. The immediate shock impact is magnified by factors of 50 or 100. So we know that people who are in this business are going to try to put it in places where it's ground coupled. So sometimes it makes finding them a little more difficult. Oh, I don't know how this one got in there. I think my friend stuck this in on me, and I didn't look at my slides before I came here. Yeah, the Navy is very much on to terrorist reduction. So what we do is, what the Navy does is when they catch one of these guys, they put him in a car and put them in the car. A little bit about the kind of diving we do. This is generally what happens. We're on Deco Helium dives down anywhere from 250 or 400 feet. We may do 2 dives a day, 5 to 6 days a week, 4-hour surface intervals. We're doing bottom times between 20 and 50 minutes. We dive RVs mostly, but we sometimes are on open circuit. Our actual bottom times, our deco times might be between 5 and an hour and a half, 5 minutes and an hour and a half. We use what we compute, okay, because we've analyzed data and fitted parameters to data. And then the traditional stagings would tell us we need to stay down for 2 hours, for 3 hours versus an hour and a half. Time is very, very important on these operations. This might be a typical kind of profile that we would have. This is an operation we carried out called Mighty Derringer. I really can't tell you where. But anyway, the first 2 dives were on nitrox to set up. Okay, we're a 28-man team. There are 5 4-man dive teams. Okay, and we have a huge military. An Air Force transport plane loaded with all of our gear. We're ready to go. And at any given time, there's usually 1 team in the water, 1 team ready to go down, 1 team on a line, or maybe 2 teams in the water, and 1 team is on the surface. And we have a surface support system, and we have lines rigged, and we don't have to worry about carrying stage bottles and things like that. We have all of this stuff rigged out because we have a dive plan. We know how deep it is. But here's what our profile might be. It'll be nitrox for the first setup dive, and then we start diving on. In this case, it was an open circuit dive on 1621. The important thing about these is that these profiles are all deep stops. They're all 2 dives a day. And every one of these, we don't switch bottom gas on open circuit. We don't make switches until we get up here in 20 feet of seawater, and then we switch to Pure 2. Okay. We've had no problems with this. We've had problems I'll show you on the slides to come in, where we've had problems in our diving, and also where we have spotted problems in our data bank. Next day would be, again, 2 dives separated by 3 or 4 hour surface interval, 180, 120 on the second dive. Again, Pure 2, this is a deep stop table. Last day we might be 1640 down to 200 feet, 15 minutes. total bottom time, and 20, 30 minutes deco time. And then the last day might be a longer dive to 300 feet. And this is kind of the kind of diving that we do. So that gives you some feeling for what our ops look like. All right, a little bit about WKPP. You guys that are cave diving and wreck diving, you're the guys that are pushing the envelope, okay? You are the guys that we want the data for, because this is the kind of data that can't be retrieved easily in a laboratory. Most chambers are not set up to do gas switches, at least the ones that I know about. Alf, maybe you may know of others, but anyway, so we want this kind of data. Here's an example of the type of cave structure that's dived in Florida. This is Wakulla Springs. Here's an opening at one end of the spring. The opening is surrounded by fencing because they have alligators floating around here. They come down to 200, 250 feet, and they do some incredible diving. These fingerlets go off into La La Land. What can you say about their profiles? Mile-long horizontal penetrations, cave penetrations. They mainly dive RVs, but they've done some open circuit stuff, and that's the information that we used. Down around 300 feet, 300-minute bottom times. Again, pure O2 at 30 feet. They actually have like a habitat. It's like a dry bar at about 30 feet where they switch over to pure O2. They do their decompression in the zone there. Their actual deco times on these open circuit dives are about 800 minutes. Phase models want RGBM, VPM, want like something like 800. If you do typical US Navy or Swiss table type of calculation, you wind up requiring 1,200 minutes. Okay, that's something that you want to do if you're not equipped for the water. I'm sorry about this slide, it didn't get turned around. Here's an example. This is the actual dive performed by, I think you guys know Jared Jablonski. He starts out here with something like 1060 down to 300 feet for a certain amount of time, and then he makes his way up. The important thing here is that he's switching helium for oxygen on the way up, and then he breathes pure O2 at the habitat, and then he comes out after about 800 minutes. If he runs a classical US Navy calculation, look at all the time he has to spend in the shallow zone. He doesn't want to do that, so he dives this way, and then this would be a bubble model calculated on his profile. It's right on. Okay, it's right on. These bubble models are getting all kinds of play. But again, this kind of stuff is anecdotal as far as the science community is concerned. That's why we got to get data. Okay? And I'll talk about this in a minute if I have time. But we have a data bank at the laboratory where we're collecting tech diver data because somebody's got to do it. It's very much like Dan's dive collection effort for recreational data. We don't use their recreational data, and it's their business, it's not ours, but we certainly collaborate. Our work at the laboratory, this was a part of a report submitted to Congress for additional funding, that funding for everything, although we have pretty good money for these kinds of operations. All right, something about field tests, okay? Field tests are things that happen that we know about, okay? They're your dive profiles that you report on the net or you send in to us. Let me just clock some that I know about here about our GBM. We've made over 2,200 dives on our GBM, 300 altitude dives on air. There are 100 plus WKPP dives, 20,000 dives by now Tech Ops because they have released bubble model tables. And these are both in the recreational regime and also in the tech regime. This particular bubble model is encoded into a growing list of decompression meters, okay? Sunto Maris, Hydrospace, Plexus, Deco, Ziegel, UDI, which is an Israeli device. Steam Machines builds rebreathers. This is not pure science, okay? It's impressive, but a lot of people tend to ignore it. Not everybody, okay? It's impressive and it's hard to ignore, but we still need more science. You never have enough science. Okay? What's non-anecdotal about some of these models? Okay, well, okay, actual mixed gas Deco diving for 5 to 15 years with few problems. That's sort of anecdotal. Project Dive Exploration and RGBM Data Bank are data collection efforts to get more data, okay? Then we have some lab experiments, okay? We've done all kinds of in vitro experiments, I mean, outside of the body. I've got that turned around, it's in vivo. We are outside the body in our experiments, okay? We've done some testing, but we haven't. So we've done experiments. Alf has done an experiment. He's doing a lot of experiments. One in particular, I think he took pigs down to about 120 for 90 minutes. 90 minutes, and then he brought them up, and then he surface decompressed these pigs in a pure O2 environment. Is that right?
No, not exactly. I'll show it tomorrow.
Okay. But anyway, the important thing is he looked at 3 different ascent schemes. Okay, and it turned out the standard staging approach of the U.S. Navy versus another 2, which were more accelerated and a little bit faster, produced more separated gas, as he measured. And when we fold that analysis over a bubble model, we find out that it gives pretty good qualitative results with what Alf got in the laboratory. Charlie Lehner at the University of Wisconsin is doing all kinds of deep submarine escape tests because we're worried about submariners who get trapped in submarines. And he's also done experiments on repetitive diving, and he's doing some on deep stops. Then there are the, Mike Powell works at NASA. He's worked with looking at bubble formation in astronauts in very, very low gravity. Eichels, Campbell, and Craig looked at forming bubbles by rubbing surfaces together, okay? And that's called tribonucleation. Tribonucleation in the body as a result of exercise might be a cause of forming bubbles. Okay. Muscle tissue rubbing together may cause bubbles. Okay, it's a good candidate. There may be other mechanisms that ameliorate that, but that's one of the mechanisms. Finally, the Naval Experimental Diving Unit is testing deep stops. Unfortunately, they're testing it on air. Deep air, which is probably not something that you guys would do. We hope to get more from you, and we hope to have more that we can feed in. Okay, formal validation of any type of model for diving requires publishing the results and doing some type of statistical analysis. That hasn't been done for the tech diving community, but we are in the process of doing it. Okay, we're in the process of doing it because it's really important. Because the kind of diving that tech divers do is the kind of diving that furnishes additional information where the models come short. Okay, that brings up the data bank. This is located at Los Alamos National Laboratory. It's used to tune modeling and model parameters. Important, risk analysis. So once we fit the data, we can generate risks for dive profiles. That's important. We store diving information, can be used in litigation. Okay? We can present quantitative material supporting or not supporting a viewpoint about a dive if it winds up in court. We like to have a lot of hits, okay? It turns out that DC hits are good for statistics, bad for divers. Okay, I was talking to Don this morning, and we certainly want this data. Even though you're not in the best shape when you came up on that dive. Much needed, this information will be published and updated. So send us your tech and extreme recreational profiles. We filter the information, okay? What does the information look like? Well, what have we got so far? It's a mixed gas data bank located in Atlanta, although the training agencies are helping us. Right now we have about 2,800 profiles with 19 DCS hits. Okay, these are chamber hits. Okay, it's not anecdotal. What are the categories? Deep nitrox, reverse profiles, decompression. Just deep nitrox, 3 hits. Deep nitrox might be 180, something like that. Okay, that's pushing the oxtox limits, but that's less of a concern for some people. Deep trimix, reverse profiles, 2 hits. Deep trimix, 2 hits. Deep heliox, OC, which you don't see very much, 2 hits. And then rebreathers, 5 hits. Nitrox, trimix, heliox, diluent. We filter the information. This is similar to the information that Dan gets on computer downloads, except we don't do computer loads, okay? We're not, that's not our job. Here's what the information is. Bottom mix, an OC, PPO2, your set point on your CCR, ascent and descent range, any type of stage deco or PPO2 change, surface intervals, time to fly, diver age, weight, sex, outcome, DCS, oxtox, 6, sick, okay, not okay, I'm ready to dive again. 1 to 5. We have varied entries, okay? This comes from a SEAL in Hawaii. He did 20 consecutive days of trimix diving down to 350, 400 feet. Now, I know this guy, so I believe this profile. Okay? This is the kind of information that comes in, and of course we talk with people, and I got 5 minutes, yeah. This kind of information that comes in from that tech diver. Also, at the Biotron at the University of Wisconsin, as I mentioned earlier, Charlie Lehner is performing submarine rescue simulations with animals, and he has essentially sheep or goats that are saturated at 132 feet, and then he brings them up to the surface with different staging protocols. Of course, none of them work. There are oxtox problems in addition to decompression. But when this happens, and it doesn't work out the way we want it as divers, it's good information. There was one other thing I wanted to go back to. I got a minute here. For recreational diving, some of the Dan folks are looking at deep stops, okay, for recreational diving. And it's not entirely clear that it's that necessary. We know that ahead of time because recreational divers have been diving 130 feet on air and coming up to the surface within the NDLs. But there's movement afoot to look at deep stops for the recreational diving community. And some of the training agencies have already incorporated deep stop protocols, okay? What they do is they tell their divers, whatever your bottom depth is, you make a stop for a minute at 1/2 the maximum bottom depth. This is filtering into the recreational community. Whether it's needed or not is still a question. Okay, I think that brings me to the end. I got, what, 5 minutes? Let me give you the bottom line on this. Mixed gas, Deco, tech diving is pushing the envelope. We need all that information as divers, as scientists, as doctors. What we're seeing is deeper stops, shorter deco, helium-rich mixtures. Okay? Helium is no longer a voodoo gas. Even the recreational community is starting to learn about helium. They're diving heliotrox, which is an enriched helium mixture. Okay? Instead of nitrox, you replace it with helium instead of nitrogen, so you have what's called heliotrox. We need to worry about isobaric mixture matching, okay? The diving that I showed you and the data we have supports the fact that you don't want to be slamming gradients of dissimilar gases in diving. You want to make it a smooth transition. This is typically not the classical staging. Divers are reporting feeling better when diving on helium. This is a qualitative statement. I mean, I'm not trying to justify it medically. No alarming DCS rates. We've not seen any. I don't think anybody's ever reported any in any publications diving with these new approaches to diving. Hundreds of thousands of dives on dive computers using these bubble models, and the dive manufacturers tell us, that there are no spikes in DCS either. In fact, the rate has remained roughly the same. There are technical diving data bank is coming online. We solicit your input. I'll be glad to give you my email, and if you have profiles of interest that you think, send them to me, and we'll be glad to look at it. This is an evolution to revolution, but with all change in science, there's always resistance to change. So, thank you, and if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
A question for you. I'm a physiologist and an MD working with sports medicine. And one factor usually not very well mentioned in diving, and now Paddy decided to take all the medical checks away, is the shape of the person you're actually looking at.
Oh, yeah.
Because this would be a nightmare for me. I mean, what kind of tissues and how well are they perfused? Are you doing any kind of tries to separate this so we can have an understanding how important it is to be in good shape?
Yes, it is. I mean, that's very important. And let me tell you right at the outset that that's one of the reasons why we filter the information. We're filtering information from fit divers that we know, and we know that they're good divers, and we also know that they're in fairly good shape. So we're not.
You see a lot of guys standing outside a tech seminar smoking. Seems to be a very good idea if you're going to go deep dive.
Yeah.
It's another thing that also takes down circulation quite effectively.
You're right. Actually, when I think about our profiles, I'm sure there are one or two smokers in there, but the guys are young and in fairly good shape. I certainly would agree with your observation that physical fitness is a main player in all of this anyway. But it's sort of like Navy testing. The early testing was with young divers, 20 to 21, and things like that. So we have this too. I mean, I still dive, and I haven't, in our operations, I've only been hit once, and that was way back on reverse profiles. But I appreciate your observation. That's certainly true. Anybody else?
Yes, and Europe is now incorporating RGBM in all its technical programs. So,
Who is?
Andy.
Oh, Andy. Yeah, sure. I should have mentioned that. I'm sorry.
So we should be able to feature a data bank. But I got another question. Is the use of rebreathers minimizing the risk of counter diffusion?
Oh, there is, well, yeah, there is no problems with counter diffusion with rebreathers because your gas mixture, I mean, on a CCR, your gas mixture, the relative fractions of inert gas that you breathe, the ratios remain the same all the way up and down. So you don't have any mismatches of in-gassing and out-gassing gradients. If you change PPO, that will just lower, or I mean, if you increase PPO2, that will raise up the inert gas fraction of the diluent, but it'll be in the same ratio. So you don't have to worry about ICD on RVs. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's right. So that's one reason to dive a rebreather.
Oh yeah, amen. We can't. Any other?
I chose to use the RGBM model, but I've been told that it's not that perfect for 330 feet and below. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
The RGBM.
Yes.
I've been told that the model itself is not that effective deeper than 330 feet. Or is it just misunderstanding?
Not accepted where?
Excuse me?
I'm sorry, you said it wasn't accepted where?
Not accepted. It wasn't appropriate to use the RGBM model for deeper than 100 meters or 330 feet of diving. Is that just a misunderstanding, or is this something?
Our operations go down to 500 feet. I have data in the data bank down to 840 feet where it was successful. There have been some problems with some divers who have attempted to dive it to 800, 900 feet and suffered problems, in looking at what happened, we realized that there were two things. One, there was diver error and lack of planning.